The wind cut like glass through the forest as Ethan Cole stopped dead in the snow, his breath fogging at 20 degrees below, while Rex, his German shepherd, stood frozen, ears locked on something no human could hear. Then came the sound, faint, broken, a dying whimper, and seconds later Ethan was running, crashing through ice and branches until he saw it. A mother dog curled tight around her puppies, all nearly frozen solid. And one wasn't moving. "No, not today," he muttered, ripping off his jacket, pulling them close, but the smallest pup went still in his hands until Rex stepped in, pressing warmth, refusing to give up, and then a twitch, a breath, life returning. Ethan froze, staring as Rex suddenly turned and barked toward the trees like something or someone was still waiting out there. Some sounds aren't meant to be heard in a storm, the old man once said. But on that night, Ethan Cole heard one anyway, thin and fragile beneath the howl of the wind, a sound that didn't belong in a place where everything else had already surrendered to the cold, and it made him stop in the middle of the snow-covered trail, his boots sinking an inch into the frozen crust as the air burned his lungs at 15 degrees below zero. Beside him, Rex stood perfectly still, ears lifted, body tense. In a way Ethan had learned never to ignore, not in the field, not anywhere, because Rex didn't react without reason, and whatever he was hearing now was pulling at him like a thread tied to something hidden just beyond sight. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching the breath drift into the dark like smoke, and for a moment he almost turned back, because nights like this weren't meant for wandering, they were meant for surviving, and he had done enough of that already. But Rex took one step forward, then another, and that was all it took. They moved off the trail and into the trees, branches creaking softly under the weight of ice, the world narrowing to the crunch of snow and the distant, broken whimper that came again, weaker this time, like it was fading with every second. Ethan's jaw tightened as he pushed through the underbrush, his gloves scraping against frozen bark, until the trees opened into a small hollow where the wind dropped just enough for silence to settle in, and that was when he saw her. The mother dog lay curled tightly in the snow, her body wrapped around a cluster of tiny shapes pressed against her chest, her fur dusted white, her sides barely moving as if each breath had to be fought for. And for a second Ethan just stood there, the memory of other nights, other losses, flickering behind his eyes, the kind that taught a man not to get involved, not to reach for things he couldn't save. But Rex didn't hesitate. He moved forward slowly, carefully, lowering his head as if he understood the gravity of what lay before them. And one of the small shapes shifted weakly, a faint sign of life that felt almost impossible in that kind of cold. Ethan knelt down, the snow soaking through his jeans, and reached out, his hand hovering for just a moment before it settled gently against the mother dog's side, feeling the faintest warmth still there, still holding on. "You're not done yet," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. And as he pulled his jacket open, gathering the fragile lives into what little heat he could offer, Rex lifted his head suddenly, ears snapping toward the darkness beyond the trees, his body going rigid once more, as if the night itself had just whispered something neither of them could ignore. And somewhere deep in the forest, something unseen was waiting. The cold settled deeper as Ethan tightened his grip around the small, fragile bodies pressed against his chest, their faint warmth barely enough to fight the biting air that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing. And for a moment he wondered how long they had been out here, how long the mother had held her ground against a night that did not forgive weakness, and the thought lingered in his mind like an echo he could not silence. But Rex broke it with a low, steady rumble, not fear, not aggression, something else entirely, something Ethan had only heard a handful of times before, the kind of sound that meant attention, that meant something unseen had already noticed them. Ethan lifted his head slowly, scanning the tree line where shadows stretched long and still, the snow reflecting just enough pale light from the sky to make the forest look almost unreal, as if it were holding its breath along with them. And then he felt it, not a sound, not a movement, but a shift, subtle and quiet, like the moment before something reveals itself. And Rex took a step back, positioning himself between Ethan and the dark beyond, his posture firm, protective, the same stance he had taken years ago in places far more dangerous than this. And that memory passed through Ethan like a distant storm, reminding him that instinct was not something to ignore. He adjusted the bundle in, his arms careful not to disturb the tiny lives clinging to what little strength they had left. And the mother dog stirred faintly, her eyes opening just enough to meet his. And in that brief exchange there was no fear, no resistance, only a quiet understanding that felt almost too human to explain, as if she knew he had come not by chance, but because something had guided him here. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of that thought settling heavier than the cold, because he had not followed the trail for any reason other than Rex, and Rex had not moved without cause. The wind shifted then, softer now, carrying with it a faint scent that did not belong to the clean, frozen air, something older, something buried beneath time and snow. And Rex reacted instantly, his ears snapping forward again as he turned his head toward a narrow path that Ethan had not noticed before, half hidden between two fallen trees, its surface untouched, as if no one had walked it in years. And yet something about it felt wrong to ignore, like a door left slightly open in an empty house. Ethan hesitated, just for a second, because every instinct told him to get back to the cabin, to warmth, to safety, to do what made sense, but something deeper, quieter, held him in place, the same feeling that had followed him since he left everything behind, the sense that the path ahead, no matter how uncertain, mattered more than the one behind. Rex stepped toward the narrow opening, then stopped, turning back, to meet Ethan's eyes as if waiting for permission. And in that moment, the choice became clear in a way Ethan could not explain, not logic, not reason, just a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with something else, something he had not believed in for a long time. "All right," he said under his breath, though the words felt less like a decision and more like an acceptance. And together they moved forward, leaving the familiar trail behind as the forest seemed to close around them, the air growing stiller with each step, the silence deeper, until even the sound of their movement felt muted, as if the world itself was guiding them gently toward something waiting just out of reach. The path curved slowly, leading them downhill through a stretch of trees that grew closer together, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel carved from shadow and frost, and the scent in the air grew stronger, mixed now with something faintly metallic, something that tugged at the edge of memory, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken despite the cold, because there was a pattern here, something deliberate, something too precise to be chance. And Rex slowed, his steps careful, measured, until he stopped completely at the edge of a small clearing where the snow lay undisturbed except for one thing. A shape, half buried, barely visible beneath the surface, its outline unnatural against the soft curves of the snow. And Ethan moved closer, lowering himself carefully while keeping the puppy secure, his free hand brushing away the thin layer of frost until cold metal met his touch, solid and real. And for a moment he simply stared at it, the edges worn, the surface marked by time, but not erased. And as he cleared more of it away, the faint outline of letters began to emerge, barely legible but unmistakable, and something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, because whatever this was, it had not been lost by accident. And the mother dog stirred once more in his arms, her gaze drifting weakly toward the object as if recognizing it, as if this place, this hidden path, had always been part of her story. And Rex let out a soft, deliberate bark, not loud, not urgent, but certain, the kind of sound that marked a beginning rather than a warning. And Ethan felt the weight of it settle into him as he looked out across the silent clearing, realizing that the night had not led him here to save something, but to find something that had been waiting far longer than he had been lost. The metal felt colder than the air around it as Ethan brushed away the last thin layer of snow, revealing a small, weathered tag half buried in the frozen ground, its edges worn smooth as if it had been waiting here through seasons no one had counted. And for a moment he simply stared at it, the weight of something unspoken settling into his chest, because objects like this did not end up in places like this without a story. And stories like that rarely stayed buried forever. Rex stepped closer, lowering his head, his nose hovering just above the surface before he gave a soft, deliberate huff, as if confirming what Ethan was only beginning to understand. And behind him, the mother dog shifted weakly again, her gaze fixed not on Ethan, not on the trees, but on the small piece of metal now resting in his hand. And there was something in that look that felt less like coincidence and more like memory, like recognition carried quietly through time. Ethan turned the tag over slowly, his fingers stiff from the cold, and the faint outline of engraved letters caught what little light filtered through the trees, barely visible but still there, stubborn against the years. And he leaned closer, narrowing his eyes until the name began to take shape, not fully clear, but enough to feel real, enough to matter. And as he traced the letters with his thumb, a strange thought crossed his mind, not loud, not forceful, just present, that maybe this had never been lost at all. Maybe it had been left. The wind had. Gone still now, completely still, the kind of silence that did not feel empty but full, as if the forest itself was holding something back, waiting to see what he would do next. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath lingering in front of him before fading into nothing. And for the first time since stepping off the trail, he felt the cold differently, not as something to endure, but as something that had led him here, step by step, choice by choice, guided by instincts he had almost forgotten how to trust. Rex shifted his weight again, his ears flicking toward the far side of the clearing. And then he began to move, not quickly, not urgently, but with purpose, each step placed carefully as he walked past the spot where the tag had been. Found and continued toward a line of trees that looked no different from the others, and yet something about them felt quieter, deeper, as if they guarded something just beyond sight, and Ethan hesitated only long enough to adjust the fragile bundle in his arms, pulling the puppies closer, making sure they were still breathing, still holding on, before he followed. The ground beneath his boots changed as he crossed the clearing, the snow thinning slightly, revealing patches of frozen earth. Beneath, uneven and marked by faint depressions that could have been footprints once, long ago, before time and weather softened their edges into something almost invisible. And he slowed, studying them without fully understanding why, only knowing that they felt important in a way he could not explain. The trees ahead parted just enough to reveal a narrow opening, not quite a path, more like a space where something had once moved often enough to shape the land around it. And as Rex stepped through, he paused again, turning back briefly, his amber eyes catching Ethan's, steady and certain. And in that look there was no doubt, no hesitation, only a quiet insistence that whatever lay ahead was meant to be found. Ethan followed, the air shifting again as he entered the space beyond, warmer somehow, or maybe just less sharp, and the scent from before returned, stronger now, mixed with something else, something faintly familiar, like old wood, like something built by hands that were no longer here. The trees thinned gradually, opening into another small clearing, this one different from the last. The snow disturbed in uneven patterns, as if it had been touched not long ago, though no fresh tracks were visible, only the suggestion of movement, the echo of something that had passed through and left behind only the feeling of its presence. And there, just beyond the center of the clearing, partially hidden beneath a slope of earth and snow, was the outline of something larger, something that did not belong to the forest at all. Its shape too straight, too deliberate, the edges softened by time, but still unmistakably made by design. Ethan stopped without realizing it, his breath catching slightly as he took it in, because even from a distance, there was a weight to it, a sense that whatever this was, it had not been forgotten, only waiting, the way certain. Things did when the right moment had not yet arrived. Rex moved ahead slowly, circling the structure with careful steps, his nose tracing the air as if reading something invisible. And then he stopped near what looked like a recessed section along the side, lowering his head toward the ground before pawing gently at the snow. Not digging, not frantic, just enough to reveal what lay beneath. And Ethan stepped closer, kneeling once more despite the cold, his free hand brushing away the thin layer. until wood met his touch this time, old and worn but still solid. And as he cleared more of it, the shape of a small door began to emerge, its surface marked by age, its handle barely visible beneath the frost. The mother dog stirred again in his arms, her body shifting slightly as if the movement itself took effort, and her eyes drifted toward the door, lingering there with a quiet intensity that felt almost like longing. And Ethan felt that same unspoken understanding return, stronger now, clearer, as if the pieces were beginning to align in a way he had not expected, and Rex let out a single, soft bark, not a warning, not a call for attention, but something else entirely, something that sounded almost like recognition, and Ethan rested his hand against the cold wood of the door, the surface steady beneath his palm, and for a moment he did not move, because something deep inside him knew that whatever waited on the other side was not just part of their night, but part of something that had been unfolding long before they ever stepped into the snow. The wood beneath Ethan's hand felt older than it should have, not weak, not broken, but patient, like something that had endured without asking to be found. And for a moment he simply stood there, his palm resting against the surface as the quiet pressed in around him, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty, but full of something waiting to be acknowledged. Rex shifted beside him, his breath steady, his posture calm but alert, and then the dog leaned forward slightly, pressing his nose near. The edge of the door where frost had gathered thicker than the rest, as if sealing it shut, and he exhaled slowly, a warm breath against the cold wood, causing a thin line of ice to soften and melt just enough to reveal the faint outline of seam that had been hidden beneath layers of time. Ethan noticed it immediately, his eyes narrowing as he traced the line with his fingers, feeling the slight difference in texture, the subtle give that suggested this was not just part of the earth, not just a buried object, but something meant to open, something meant to be entered. And the realization settled into him with a quiet weight, because doors existed for a reason, and reasons like this were rarely simple. He adjusted the puppies carefully against his chest, feeling their small bodies press closer to the warmth, their breaths faint but present, and the mother dog stirred again, her head lifting just slightly, her eyes drifting toward the door as if drawn to it, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that felt like memory returning after a long absence. And Ethan found himself following that gaze, his own uncertainty giving way to a quiet sense of inevitability. He brushed away more of the frost, clearing the edges until the outline became clearer, the shape of a small handle emerging from beneath the ice, worn smooth as if it had been used countless times before being left behind, and he hesitated for just a second, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment, because something told him that once he crossed this threshold, whatever lay ahead would not simply be discovered. It would change him. The forest remained still, no wind, no distant sound, just the soft rhythm of breath and the faint creak of trees settling in the cold. And Ethan drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, before curling his fingers around the handle, the metal biting cold against the skin even through the glove, and he pulled gently at first, testing it, expecting resistance, but instead the door shifted with a low, quiet sound, not loud, not sudden, just enough to signal that it had been waiting for this moment. The snow around the edges cracked, softly as the door gave way, opening inward to reveal a narrow, dark space beyond, not deep, not endless, but enough to hold something unseen, and a faint breath of air moved outward from within, warmer than the night, carrying with it that same scent from before, now stronger, clearer, a mix of aged wood and something else, something human, something that had once belonged to life. Rex stepped forward immediately, his body lowering slightly as he peered into the opening, his ears flicking as he listened, not tense, not alarmed, but focused, as if whatever lay inside was not a threat, but a presence, and Ethan felt that same quiet pull again, the sense that this was not an accident, not a coincidence, but a path that had been unfolding long before he ever set foot in the snow. He knelt down slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile lives he carried, and leaned closer to the opening, his eyes adjusting to the dimness within, where faint shapes began to form, outlines of wooden walls, a narrow passage leading inward, and something else, something resting just beyond sight, and the air that drifted out carried a stillness that felt preserved, untouched, as if time had paused here and simply waited. The mother dog shifted again, this time more noticeably, her body tensing, slightly as she lifted her head higher, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the door, and Ethan felt the movement through his arms, felt the subtle change in her breathing, and something about it told him that this place was not unfamiliar to her, that whatever lay inside was part of her story in a way he could not yet understand. Rex let out a soft, almost questioning sound, his tail moving once, slow and deliberate, and then he stepped inside, just one step, placing his paw carefully on the wooden floor beyond the threshold, testing it, feeling it, and when it held firm, when nothing shifted or gave way, he moved another step forward, his body disappearing partially into the dim interior before he paused again, turning his head back toward Ethan, waiting, always waiting. Ethan followed, his movements steady despite the uncertainty, lowering himself enough to step through the opening without disturbing the bundle in his arms. And as he crossed the threshold, the cold seemed to loosen its grip slightly, not gone, but softened, replaced by a quiet stillness that felt almost protective, and he took a moment to stand there, just inside, letting his eyes adjust fully to the space around him. The interior was simple, small, carved into the earth with careful intention. Wooden beams supporting the ceiling, shelves built into the walls, and a narrow path leading deeper inside. And though dust lay across every surface, there was something about it that did not feel abandoned, not truly, as if someone had left with the intention of returning, and simply never did. Ethan stepped forward slowly, each movement measured, each breath steady, and as he moved further inside, something caught his attention near the far wall, a shape resting on one of the shelves, partially covered in a thin layer of dust, and he approached it carefully, his free hand reaching out to brush it away, revealing the outline of an object that had once been handled often, something personal, something that did not belong to the forest at all. And behind him, Rex stood still once more, his ears lifting slightly, not toward the outside, not toward the trees, but deeper within the space, as if something else, something unseen, was still waiting to be found. The object beneath Ethan's fingers revealed itself slowly as the dust gave way, not all at once, but in quiet fragments, the kind that asked to be noticed rather than discovered, and as his hand brushed across its surface, the shape became clearer, a small wooden box, worn at the edges, its grain darkened by time, yet still intact in a way that suggested it had been cared for once, long before it had been left behind. He paused, his breath steady but shallow, because something about it felt personal, not abandoned, not forgotten, but placed as if someone had set it there with intention, trusting that one day it would be found by the right hands, and that thought lingered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Rex remained still behind him, his presence quiet but constant, and then the dog took a single step forward, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor, the sound echoing faintly in the enclosed space. And he lowered his head slightly, not to inspect the box, but to listen, his ears tilting toward the deeper part of the structure, as if something beyond it was breathing in a rhythm too subtle for human senses to catch. Ethan noticed the shift immediately, the way Rex's body aligned, the way his focus sharpened, and it pulled at something inside him, that same instinct he had relied on in places where hesitation cost more than time. And yet he did not move right away, because the box in front of him demanded attention in a quieter way. Not urgent, not loud, but steady. He ran his thumb along the edge of the lid, feeling the faint groove where it met the base, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect, because opening something like this felt less like uncovering an object and more like stepping into a memory that did not belong to him, and yet, somehow, had found its way to him anyway. The puppies stirred, gently against his chest, their movements small but alive, their warmth growing just enough to remind him why he was here, why he had followed the sound, the path, the silence that had led him to this place, and the mother dog shifted again, her head lifting higher this time, her eyes settling on the box with a quiet intensity that felt unmistakable. And in that moment, Ethan understood something without needing it explained, that whatever lay inside was connected to her, not by chance, but by something deeper, something that had been waiting. He lifted the lid slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness of the space, and, as it opened, the faint scent of aged paper and wood drifted upward, subtle but distinct, carrying with it a sense of time preserved rather than lost. And inside, nestled carefully within the box, lay a collection of items that did not belong to the forest at all, objects shaped by hands, by lives, by stories that had once been lived fully and then set. Aside, there was a folded piece of cloth, worn but clean, a small metal tag similar to the one he had found outside, and beneath them, a stack of papers bound together with a thin strip of leather, their edges yellowed but intact, and Ethan felt his breath catch slightly as he reached for them, because there was something about the way they were arranged that felt deliberate, almost as if they had been left not just to be found, but to be understood. Rex let out a soft sound behind him, not urgent, not warning, but present, a reminder that this moment, though quiet, was part of something larger, and Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, before lifting the papers carefully, his fingers brushing against the surface as he unfolded the first page, the texture rough but steady, and as his eyes moved across the faded lines, the words began to take shape, not all at once, but enough to feel real, enough to carry weight. He did not read them fully, not yet, because something about the space around him had shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, and he felt it before he heard it, a faint sound deeper within the structure, not loud, not clear, but present, like the soft movement of something settling. After a long stillness, and Rex reacted instantly, his body straightening, his ears locking onto the direction of the sound, his attention no longer divided, but focused entirely on what lay ahead. Ethan lowered the paper slightly, his gaze lifting toward the narrow passage that extended beyond the room. The darkness there deeper than before, not empty, but waiting, and he felt that same quiet pull again, stronger now, clearer, as if the path he had followed through the forest had not ended at the door, but had only just begun. The mother dog shifted once more, her body pressing slightly closer against him, her breath steadier now, her presence grounding him in a way he had not expected, and he adjusted his hold gently, making sure the puppies remained secure, their small eyes a reminder that whatever this place held, whatever it meant, it was not separate from the reason he had come here, it was part of it. He set the papers back into the box carefully, not closing it fully, just enough to keep them safe, and rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate, his focus shifting from what had been found to what still remained unseen. And Rex moved ahead once more, stepping toward the passage with the same quiet certainty that had guided them through the storm, through the forest, through the silence that now seemed to hum with something just beneath the surface. Ethan followed, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath his boots, each step carrying him further into a place that felt less like a shelter and more like a story unfolding in real time. And as the light from the entrance faded behind him, the darkness ahead did not feel threatening, not exactly, but heavy with something that had been waiting, not for just anyone, but for someone who would listen, someone who would follow, someone who would not turn away when the night asked a question that could not be ignored. The passage narrowed as Ethan moved deeper, the wooden beams above lowering just enough to make him instinctively bow his head, not out of necessity, but out of something quieter, a sense of entering a place that asked for respect without ever saying it aloud. And the air shifted again, warmer now, carrying a faint stillness that felt preserved, untouched by the chaos of the storm outside, as if this space existed just beyond the reach of time itself. Rex walked ahead with careful steps, his body low but steady, his ears flicking occasionally as he listened to something Ethan could not yet hear, and the faint sound from before came again, clearer this time. Not a voice, not quite a movement, but a soft, rhythmic tapping, distant yet deliberate, like something marking time in a place where time no longer mattered. Ethan slowed, his breath steady but his senses sharpening, every instinct rising quietly to the surface, not with fear, but with awareness, the kind that had carried him through nights far darker than this one. And yet this felt different. Not danger, not threat, but something waiting to be understood rather than confronted. The floor beneath his boots shifted slightly, not unstable, but uneven, the wood worn in subtle patterns that suggested it had been walked many times before, long before it had been left in silence. And he followed the path as it curved gently to the right, the darkness ahead thinning just enough to reveal the faint outline of another room. Larger than the first, its edges softened by shadow and time. The tapping sound grew steadier as he approached, no longer distant, but present, echoing softly through the space, and Rex paused at the threshold, his body still, his head tilted slightly, as if listening not just to the sound, but to what lay behind it, and Ethan stepped beside him, his gaze lifting slowly as his eyes adjusted to the dim light that filtered through a narrow opening above, just enough to illuminate what lay within. The room was simple, yet different from the rest, more deliberate, more lived in, as if it had once served a purpose beyond shelter, and along one wall stood a wooden table, its surface marked by years of use, and on it, a small object moved with a steady rhythm, the source of the sound that had drawn them deeper inside. Ethan took a step closer, his movements careful, his breath quiet, and as he neared the table, the object came into focus, a small mechanical device, its surface aged but intact, a simple pendulum swinging back and forth with quiet precision, each movement producing the soft tapping that echoed through the room, steady and unwavering, as if it had never stopped, as if it had been waiting all this time, keeping count of moments no one else had been there to witness. He stood there for a long second, watching it, feeling the rhythm settle into him in a way that felt almost grounding, and something about it stirred a memory he could not fully place, the idea that not everything abandoned was truly left behind, that some things continued on their own, waiting for the right moment to be noticed again. Rex moved forward slowly, his gaze shifting from the device to the rest of the room, his nose lifting slightly as he traced the air, and then he turned his attention toward the far corner, where the shadows gathered more heavily, and he let out a soft, low sound, not warning, not alarm, but recognition. The same tone he had used earlier, the same quiet certainty that something more lay just beyond what they could see. Ethan followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he stepped away from the table, the steady tapping continuing behind him like a heartbeat that refused to fade. And as he moved toward the corner, the darkness shifted just enough to reveal another shape, low to the ground, partially obscured by a layer of dust and time, and he knelt slowly, careful with the bundle in his arms, his hand reaching out to brush away the surface until the outline became clearer. It was another box, larger than the first, its lid closed but not sealed, its edges worn but solid. And something about it felt heavier, not in weight, but in presence, as if whatever lay inside carried more than just objects, carried something that had been held onto for a reason. The mother dog stirred again, her body shifting slightly as her gaze moved toward the box. And this time there was no question in it, no uncertainty, only a quiet pull, as if she recognized this place not just as shelter, but as something she had known before, something she had returned to when there was nowhere else to go. Ethan felt that connection settle into him, not fully understood, but undeniable, and he rested his hand on the lid, the wood cool beneath his fingers, and for a moment he did not open it. Not yet, because the room itself seemed to hold its breath, the steady rhythm of the pendulum marking each second as if counting down to something, and Rex stood beside him, still and focused, his presence grounding in a way that words could not capture. And Ethan realized then that this was not just a place they had found. It was a place they had been led to, step by step, sound by sound, until there was no turning back, only forward into whatever truth had been waiting in the silence all along. The weight of the moment lingered in the air as Ethan rested his hand on the larger box, the steady ticking of the pendulum behind him marking each second with quiet precision. And for a brief instant, he allowed himself to simply listen, not just to the sound, but to the stillness wrapped around it, because something about this place did not rush. It waited, and that waiting felt intentional, as if every step he had taken had been part of a path laid long before he ever heard the first faint cry in the storm. Rex stood close at his side, his posture calm but attentive, his eyes fixed on the box with a focus that spoke of recognition rather than curiosity. And when Ethan finally lifted the lid, he did so slowly, not because it was difficult, but because something inside him understood that whatever lay beneath would not just answer questions, it would change them. The lid opened with a soft, worn sound, and inside, the contents revealed themselves not as scattered objects, but as something arranged with care, with intention, as if each piece held meaning that extended beyond itself. There was a folded blanket, small and neatly placed, its fabric worn but clean, and beside it, a collar, simple but sturdy, the leather aged yet intact. And as Ethan reached for it, his fingers brushing against the surface, he felt a faint imprint where something had once been attached, something that was no longer there, and his mind flickered briefly to the metal tag outside, the connection forming quietly, almost naturally, as if it had been waiting for him to notice. The mother dog shifted again, her body pressing slightly closer as her eyes followed the movement, and when Ethan lifted the collar gently, her gaze softened in a way that did not need explanation. A quiet recognition that spoke of belonging, of memory carried not in words but in presence. And for a moment, the space between them felt less like a chance encounter and more like a reunion that had taken time to find its way back. Beneath the collar lay something else, a small bundle of papers similar to those in the first box, but thicker, more numerous, and tied together with a thin cord that had held firm despite the years. And Ethan hesitated again, his hand hovering above them, because there was a weight here, not physical, but something deeper, something that suggested these pages held more than information. They held a voice, a story that had not yet finished speaking. Rex shifted slightly, his ears flicking toward the back of the room once more, and then returning to Ethan, as if reminding him that whatever lay here was only part of what they had come to find. And Ethan nodded faintly, more to the moment than to the dog, before lifting the bundle carefully, the cord loosening as he untied it with steady fingers. The first page unfolded slowly, the paper stiff but intact, and the writing that filled it was clear despite the fading ink, deliberate and steady, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who took their time, someone who meant every word they left behind. And as Ethan's eyes moved across the lines, he did not read them aloud. Not yet, but he felt them, the tone, the intention, the quiet presence of a person who had once stood in this very space and chosen to leave something behind, not for just anyone, but for someone who would understand. The pendulum continued its steady rhythm, the soft tapping now feeling less like a sound and more like a guide, marking the pace of something unfolding in real time, and Ethan became aware of the way the room seemed to hold itself around that rhythm. The walls, the floor, even the air itself aligned with it, as if this place existed in its own measure of time, separate from the storm, separate from the world outside. The mother dog let out a faint breath, her body relaxing slightly, as if the tension she had carried was beginning to ease, and the puppies stirred again, their movement stronger now, their presence more certain, and Ethan adjusted his hold gently, ensuring they remained warm, safe, because no matter what this place revealed, that responsibility had not changed. It had only deepened. Rex stepped closer, his nose brushing lightly against Ethan's arm before he turned once more toward the deeper shadows beyond the room. And this time, he did not stop at the edge. He moved forward with quiet confidence, disappearing briefly into the dimness before pausing, his silhouette visible against the faint light. Waiting again, always waiting. Ethan looked down at the pages in his hand, then back toward the direction Rex had gone, and he felt that same pull again, stronger now, no longer subtle, no longer uncertain, but clear in a way that left no room for doubt. And he understood then that this was not the end of what had been left behind. It was only the beginning of what had been meant to be found. And as he carefully set the pages back into the box, leaving it open just enough to return to later, he rose slowly, his movements steady despite the weight of the moment, and followed Rex into the deeper part of the structure, where the light faded and the quiet grew heavier, carrying with it the sense that whatever waited ahead had not been lost, only waiting for someone willing to listen long enough to hear it. The deeper chamber opened slowly before Ethan as the narrow passage gave way to a wider space. The air shifting again, warmer but heavier, as if it carried something more than just stillness, something that had lingered here long after the world outside had moved on. And he felt it immediately, not as a sound or a sight, but as a presence that settled quietly into the space around him, asking not to be feared, but to be understood. Rex stood near the center of the room, his posture steady, his head slightly lowered as he listened, his ears catching something so faint it barely existed, and yet it held his full attention, the same way it had since the moment they left the trail. And Ethan moved closer, his boots pressing softly against the aged wood beneath him, each step careful, deliberate, as if the floor itself held memory. The room was different from the others, not just in size, but in feeling, more complete, more intentional, as if this had once been the heart of the place, the space where something had been built, preserved, or perhaps even protected. And along the far wall stood a structure that immediately drew his eyes, a low wooden frame, carefully constructed, its surface worn but intact, and on it rested something that made him pause, not out of fear, but out of recognition he could not explain. It was a bed, simple, narrow, covered with a blanket that had faded with time, but still held its shape, and beside it, on a small table, sat another object, a lantern, its glass clouded but unbroken, its base steady as if it had been set down with the expectation that it would one day be lit again. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath catching slightly in his chest, because this was not just a shelter, it had been a place of living, of staying, of waiting, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight, because places like this did not exist without purpose. Rex moved forward again, stepping toward the bed, his nose lowering as he traced the edge of the frame, his movements calm but precise. And then he paused, lifting his head toward the wall just beyond it, where the shadows gathered more densely, and he let out a soft, low sound, not warning, not fear, but acknowledgement, as if something there had answered him in a way only he could hear. Ethan followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer, and as he did, the faint outline of markings began to reveal themselves along the wooden wall, subtle at first, almost invisible beneath the dust. But as he brushed his hand across the surface, they became clearer, lines carved carefully into the wood, not random, not careless, but deliberate, each one placed with intention, forming patterns that suggested time, measured not in hours or days, but in something more personal, something counted and remembered. He traced one of the lines with his finger, feeling the groove beneath the dust, and a quiet understanding began to form, not fully shaped, but present enough to feel that someone had lived here long enough to mark the passing of time, to leave behind proof that they had been here, that they had endured, that they had waited. The mother dog shifted again in his arms, her body relaxing more now, her breath steadier, and as Ethan turned slightly, her gaze followed the wall, lingering on the markings as if they held, meaning she could not express but still recognized, and that connection deepened the sense that this place, this hidden space beneath the forest, was not random, not abandoned, but tied to her in a way that stretched beyond the moment. Rex stepped closer to the wall, his nose brushing lightly against the surface before moving downward, tracing along the base until he reached a small, almost hidden gap near the floor, and he paused there, his ears lifting again, his body still, and then he tapped the wood gently with his paw, once, twice, not with urgency, but with certainty, as if signaling that something lay just beneath. Ethan knelt carefully, lowering himself despite the stiffness in his legs, and reached out, his fingers brushing along the edge until he felt it, a slight shift, a seam that did not belong to the natural shape of the wall. And as he pressed gently, the wood gave way just enough to reveal a narrow compartment hidden within, small but deliberate, and inside, resting quietly as if untouched by time, was a single object, wrapped in cloth, its shape defined but not yet revealed. The room seemed to grow stiller as he reached for it, the faint rhythm of the pendulum from the other room echoing distantly, steady and unwavering, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle into him again, not heavy, but significant, as if every step, every sound, every choice had led to this exact point. And as he carefully lifted the cloth-wrapped object from its resting place, he knew without needing to open it that whatever lay inside would not just explain what had been left behind, it would reveal why it had been waiting all along. The cloth felt heavier than it should have as Ethan held it in his hand, not in weight, but in meaning, as if whatever lay inside carried more than just its shape, more than just its presence. And for a moment he did not move, the quiet of the room pressing in around him while the distant rhythm of the pendulum echoed faintly through the structure, steady and unbroken, marking time that had somehow continued even when everything else had stopped. Rex stood close, his body angled toward Ethan, but his ears still tuned to something deeper, something beyond the walls, and yet he did not move forward. This time, he waited, as if this moment belonged to Ethan alone, as if whatever was about to be revealed required stillness, not urgency. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steadying as his fingers found the edge of the cloth, and he began to unwrap it with care, not rushing, not forcing, but allowing it to unfold at its own pace, layer by layer, until the shape beneath began to emerge, first the outline, then the texture, and finally the object itself, resting quietly in his palm. It was a small, metal piece, worn but intact, its surface marked by time, yet preserved in a way that suggested it had been protected, kept safe, and as he turned it slightly, the faint reflection of light revealed its form more clearly. A key, simple in design, but deliberate, its edges smooth from use, its teeth cut with precision, and something about it felt unmistakably real, not just an object, but a purpose waiting to be fulfilled. Ethan's gaze lingered on it, his thoughts moving quietly, connecting. Pieces that had begun to form since the moment he stepped off the trail, the tag in the snow, the collar in the box, the markings on the wall, and now this, each one part of something larger, something that had not been scattered by accident, but placed with intention, as if leading step by step toward a point that had not yet been reached. The mother dog shifted again, her movement stronger now, her body pressing slightly upward as her eyes fixed on the key, and there was no uncertainty in that gaze, no confusion, only recognition, as if this object, small and simple as it was, belonged to the same story she carried within her, a story that had brought her back to this place when there was nowhere else to go. Ethan felt that connection settle into him, deeper now, clearer, and he closed his fingers gently around the key, not gripping it tightly, but holding it with a quiet understanding that it was not his to keep, not truly, but his to use, his to follow. Rex stepped forward then, his movements smooth and certain, his nose lowering toward the floor before lifting again, tracing the air as he turned toward the far side of the room, where the shadows thickened once more. And he began to move, not hesitating, not questioning, as if the next step had already been decided long before they arrived. Ethan followed, the key resting securely in his hand, the puppies warm against his chest, their breaths steady, their presence grounding him in a way that kept everything else from drifting too far into uncertainty. And, as he moved deeper into the space, the air shifted again, the stillness giving way to something quieter, something almost expectant. The wall ahead revealed another subtle detail as he approached, a faint outline. Barely visible unless you were looking for it, a narrow indentation in the wood that did not match the rest, and Rex stopped there, his body still, his gaze fixed on the spot, and he let out a single, soft sound, The same tone he had used before, the same quiet certainty that had guided them this far. Ethan knelt carefully, lowering himself despite the strain, and examined the indentation closely, his fingers brushing along its edges until he felt it, the precise shape, the exact size, and he understood immediately, not through logic, but through something simpler, something that did not need explanation. He brought the key forward slowly, his movements deliberate, and for a brief second he paused, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because this was not just a mechanism, not just a hidden space. It was a continuation, a step deeper into something that had been waiting to be completed. The pendulum's rhythm seemed to align with his breath, steady and unwavering. And as he placed the key into the indentation, it fit perfectly, not forced, not adjusted, but as if it had always belonged there. And he turned it gently, the motion smooth, the sound soft, a quiet click that echoed through the room like the closing of a circle. The wood shifted slightly beneath his hand, not breaking, not cracking, but opening, revealing a hidden panel that moved just enough to expose what lay behind it. And Ethan felt his breath slow as he looked into the space beyond, not fully visible, not yet revealed, but present, waiting, and Rex stepped closer once more, his body steady, his gaze fixed, as if confirming what Ethan already knew without needing to say it, that whatever lay ahead was not just part of the past. It was something that had been waiting for him to find it, to open it, to continue the path that had begun long before the storm ever fell. The panel opened slowly, not with resistance, but with a quiet acceptance, as if it had been waiting for this exact motion, this exact moment. And as the wood shifted aside, the space beyond revealed itself in fragments, not all at once, but enough to draw Ethan forward, enough to make him lean closer despite the weight in his arms and the questions forming silently in his mind. The air that drifted out from within was different, not just warmer, but still in a way that felt untouched, like a room sealed not to hide something, but to preserve it. And for a second, Ethan simply watched, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior that now lay open before him. Rex stepped forward first, his movements slow and measured, his head lowering slightly as he peered into the hidden space, his ears flicking once, then settling, and he let out a soft breath that seemed to carry recognition rather than caution. And that alone told Ethan everything he needed to know, that whatever was inside was not a threat, but something that had been waiting to be found. Ethan shifted his weight carefully, lowering himself just enough to look inside without disturbing the fragile lives he carried. And as the dim shapes within came into focus, the meaning of this place deepened in a way he could not ignore. The compartment was not large, but it was carefully built, lined with wood that had aged evenly, protected from the elements. And at its center rested a single object, placed with intention, not hidden in haste, but positioned as if it had been meant to be discovered in exactly this way. It was a small wooden chest, darker than the others, its surface smooth but marked with faint carvings that echoed. The lines on the wall outside, patterns that spoke of time, of counting, of waiting, and Ethan felt his breath slow as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the surface, feeling the subtle grooves beneath the dust. The chest was not locked, not sealed, but it carried a presence that made him pause, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because this was not just another object, it was something final, something that did not just add to the story, but completed it. Behind him, the pendulum continued its steady rhythm, the soft tapping now more distant but still present, like a heartbeat that refused to fade, and Rex stood close at his side, his body calm, his gaze steady, as if confirming once more that this was where they were meant to be. The mother dog shifted again, her movement stronger now, her head lifting slightly as her eyes settled on the chest. And there was a quiet stillness in her gaze that felt like recognition, like closure waiting to unfold, and Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle into him. The sense that this moment, this place was not random, not accidental, but part of something that had been set in motion long before he ever heard the first faint cry in the storm. He lifted the chest slowly, the weight solid in his hands, and brought it closer, his movements careful, deliberate, as if even the act of holding it required respect. And as he set it gently on the floor beside him, he rested his hand on the lid, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingers, and for a moment, he did not open it. Not yet, because something inside him understood that once he did, there would be no turning back, no returning to the uncertainty that had carried him this far. The room seemed to grow quieter, the air settling into a stillness that felt almost sacred, and Ethan drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, before lifting the lid with care, the motion smooth, the sound soft, and, as it opened, the contents revealed themselves not in a rush, but in quiet detail, each piece resting exactly where it had been placed, untouched by time, yet carrying its weight. Inside lay a folded letter, thicker than the others, its edges worn but preserved, and beside it, a small photograph, its surface faded but still clear enough to show the outline of a figure standing beside a dog, both captured in a moment that felt simple and real, and Ethan felt something shift inside him as he looked at it. Not recognition, not memory, but connection, as if the story he had been stepping into was now beginning to reveal its voice. He reached for the letter slowly, his fingers brushing against the paper as he lifted it, feeling the weight of it in a way that went beyond its size. And as he unfolded it carefully, the first lines of writing came into view, steady and deliberate, the kind that carried intention in every stroke. And though he had not yet read the words fully, he felt their presence, the sense that they had been written not just to be read, but to be understood at the exact moment they were needed. Rex lowered himself beside him, his body resting but alert, his presence steady, and the mother dog let out a faint breath, her body relaxing further as if something within her had finally settled. And Ethan looked down at the letter once more, the quiet of the room pressing gently around him, and he realized then that this was not just the end of what had been hidden, it was the beginning of what had been meant to be known. And as his eyes moved to the first line, he understood that whatever was written there had been waiting not just for anyone, but for someone who had followed the path all the way to the end. The paper trembled slightly in Ethan's hands, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that moved quietly through him as his eyes settled on the first line. The ink faded but steady, each letter placed with care, as if the writer had known this moment would come, as if every word had been left not in haste, but in hope. He drew in a slow breath, letting the stillness of the room settle around him, and began to read, not aloud, but in silence, the meaning unfolding not just through the words, but through the weight they carried. And as the lines formed in his mind, the voice behind them became clear, calm, patient, the voice of someone who had lived long enough to understand that not everything needed to be said quickly. The letters spoke of time, not in numbers, but in seasons, in days counted by the rise and fall of light, in nights spent listening to the quiet in ways most people never learn to hear. And as Ethan continued, he felt the shape of a life begin to take form, a man who had chosen this place not to hide, but to stay, to build something that could endure beyond him, something that would not be lost even when he was gone. The words shifted then, gently, toward the dog, the companion who had shared that time, not just in presence, but in purpose, a bond described not in grand statements, but in small details, the kind that only someone who had lived it could understand, the way the dog would listen before the wind changed, the way she would wait at the door long before he returned, the way she had become not just part of his life, but the reason he had kept going when everything else had quieted. Ethan's eyes moved more slowly now, the lines drawing him deeper, and there was something in the tone that felt familiar, not because he had known this man, but because he had known the silence described between the words, the kind that came after too much had been seen, too much had been carried, and he felt a subtle shift inside himself, a recognition that did not need explanation. The letter spoke of leaving, not as a plan, but as an understanding that one day the body would no longer keep pace with the time it had measured, that the strength that had built this place would eventually fade, and that when that moment came, The only thing that mattered was that something of meaning remained, something that could be found by someone who understood what it meant to keep going even when there was no clear reason left. Ethan paused for a moment, his gaze lifting slightly from the page, the room around him still, the pendulum's rhythm faint but steady in the distance, and Rex shifted closer, his presence quiet but grounding, as if reminding him that he was not alone in this moment, not truly. He returned to the letter, his focus narrowing once more, and the words continued, now speaking directly to the one who would find it, not by name, not by description, but by action, by the simple truth that whoever stood here, whoever held this letter, had followed something that could not be explained, had chosen not to turn away when it would have been easier to do so, and that alone was enough. The message was not one of instruction, not a list of what to do or where to go, but something quieter, something deeper, an acknowledgement that kindness, when carried far enough, has a way of leading people to places they never intended to find, and that sometimes those places are not empty, they are waiting. Ethan felt his throat tighten slightly as he reached the final lines, the words soft but certain, a closing that did not feel like an ending, but like a hand placed gently on his shoulder, steadying, reassuring, telling him without saying it outright that he had not come here by accident, that the path he had followed had meaning, even if he did not yet understand all of it. He lowered the letter slowly, his fingers still resting against the edges, and for a moment he simply sat there, the weight of it settling into him, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present in a way that would not fade quickly. The mother dog shifted again, her body more relaxed now, her breathing even, and as Ethan looked down at her, he saw something different in her eyes, not just recognition, but peace, the kind that comes when something unfinished has finally found its way to completion, and the puppies moved softly against his chest, their small lives steady, their warmth no longer fragile but growing. Rex let out a quiet breath, his body easing as he lowered himself beside Ethan, his head resting gently near his knee, and the room seemed to settle with them, the air no longer heavy with waiting, but calm in a way that felt resolved, as if whatever had been held here for so long had finally been seen, finally been understood. Ethan looked down at the letter once more, then toward the photograph still resting in the chest, and he realized that what he held was not just a message from the past, but a bridge, something that connected what had been left behind to what was still ahead. And as the pendulum continued its steady rhythm in the distance, he understood that time had not been counting down to an end, but forward to this moment, where something quiet and unseen had finally found its way back into the light. The quiet that followed felt different now, no longer filled with waiting, but with something softer, something that settled into the space like a breath finally released after being held for far too long. And Ethan remained still for a moment, the letter resting lightly in his hands, his eyes no longer scanning the words, but holding on to the feeling they had left behind, because it was not just what had been written that mattered. It was what had been understood. He folded the letter carefully, not out of habit, but out of respect, his fingers smoothing the edges as if returning it to its place carried meaning of its own, and he placed it back inside the chest beside the photograph, the image catching his eye once more, the figure and the dog standing side by side in a moment that now felt less distant, less separate from where he sat. Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head before letting it rest again, his body relaxed in a way that spoke of resolution rather than vigilance, and Ethan reached out absent-mindedly, his hand brushing gently against the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth there, the quiet presence that had guided him through the storm and into this place without hesitation. The mother dog stirred again, her movements slow but stronger now, and this time she adjusted herself, curling slightly to settle more comfortably, her body no longer rigid with cold or strain, and as Ethan looked down at her, he saw the change clearly, the tension gone from her posture, replaced by something calmer, something that felt like trust, and the puppies pressed closer together, their small bodies shifting with life that no longer seemed uncertain. He let out a slow breath, one he had not realized he was holding, And for the first time since stepping into the storm, he felt something inside him ease, not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice, enough to matter. The pendulum's steady rhythm continued in the distance, but it no longer felt like a countdown. It felt like a continuation, like time moving forward again, now that something had been completed, something had been found. Ethan rose slowly, careful with the bundle in his arms, his movements steady despite the weight of the moment. And he looked around the room once more, taking in the details not as clues, not as pieces of a mystery, but as parts of life that had been lived fully within these walls, a life that had chosen to remain quiet, yet had still found a way to reach beyond itself. He stepped back toward the opening, the path now familiar in a way it had not been before. And as he moved through the passage, the air shifted again, the stillness giving way to the faint return of the outside world, the distant whisper of wind, the subtle reminder that the storm had not disappeared, only softened. Rex moved ahead of him once more, not leading now, but walking alongside. His pace matched to Ethan's, his presence steady and certain, and together they stepped back into the first room, the pendulum still swinging, still marking time in the same quiet rhythm. And Ethan paused for just a moment, his gaze settling on it, understanding. Now that it had never been about counting the seconds that passed, but about holding onto the ones that mattered. He reached out and gently touched the edge of the table, not stopping the motion, not changing it, but acknowledging it, the way one might acknowledge something that had done its part and would continue on long after. The mother dog shifted again, her head lifting slightly as they moved, her eyes following the direction of the exit. And there was no hesitation in her gaze now, no uncertainty, only a quiet readiness, as if she knew that whatever had brought her here had been completed and that it was time to move forward. Ethan stepped toward the doorway, the faint light from outside filtering in, pale and soft against the darker tones of the interior. And as he crossed the threshold once more, the cold greeted him again, sharp but no longer overwhelming, the wind gentler now. The snow settled into a quieter stillness. He paused just outside, taking in the forest around him, the trees standing silent and tall, the world unchanged yet somehow different, and he looked down at the mother dog in his arms, then at Rex beside him, and something in that moment felt clear in a way he had not expected, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a simple truth that did not need to be spoken. He turned slightly, his gaze lingering once more on the hidden entrance, now blending back into the earth as if it had never been there at all, and he understood then that some places were not meant to remain open, not meant to be visited again and again, but meant to be found once, understood, and then carried forward in a different way. Rex took a step ahead, his ears lifting slightly as he looked back at Ethan, and there was no urgency in the movement, no pull, just a quiet suggestion, and Ethan followed, his boots pressing into the snow as he moved away from the place that had changed something he could not fully name, but could not ignore. The path back through the trees felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had, and as the forest opened gradually ahead, the faint outline of his cabin waiting in the distance, he realized that whatever he had come here looking for, whether he had known it or not, had already found him long before he ever heard that first faint sound in the storm. The trail back to the cabin stretched quietly beneath Ethan's boots, each step pressing into the snow with a soft, steady rhythm that felt different now. Not just movement through the forest, but a continuation of something that had already begun to settle inside him. And the wind that once cut sharply through the trees had softened into a low whisper, as if the storm itself had passed not just through the land, but through him as well. Rex moved beside him, no longer pulling ahead, no longer. Searching, his pace matched perfectly, his presence calm and grounded, and every so often he would glance up, not to check, but to acknowledge, the way a companion does when there is nothing left to question. The mother dog rested quietly in Ethan's arms, her body no longer tense, her breathing steady and even, and the puppies shifted gently against her, their small movements carrying a warmth that had grown stronger with every step away from the cold that had nearly taken them. And Ethan adjusted his hold slightly, careful, instinctive, the way he had done so many times before with things that mattered more than. He could explain. The trees began to thin as the path opened ahead, the faint outline of his cabin appearing through the branches, its shape familiar yet somehow different now. Not because it had changed, but because he had, and as he approached, the quiet of the place greeted him in a way it never had before, not empty, not hollow, but waiting, ready to hold something new. He reached the door and pushed it open with his shoulder, the wood creaking softly as the warmer air inside met the cold behind him, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting the shift in temperature settle, the subtle scent of wood and stillness wrapping around him as he stepped inside. Rex moved ahead, circling once before settling near the hearth, his body lowering to the floor with a quiet exhale, and Ethan crossed the room slowly, kneeling near the fire pit as he carefully laid the mother dog down on a blanket, arranging it gently beneath her, ensuring the puppies remained close, their small bodies instinctively pressing together for warmth. He moved with care, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, the way someone does when they understand that the smallest actions can carry the greatest meaning. And as he finished, the mother dog lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment, and in that look there was no fear, no confusion, only something quiet and steady, something that felt like trust given without question. Ethan sat back on his heels for a moment, watching. As the puppies shifted again, their movement stronger now, their small breath steady, and he reached for a piece of wood, placing it carefully into the fire, coaxing the flame back to life until it flickered softly, casting a warm glow across the room. The light moved gently over the walls, over Rex resting nearby, over the small group now safe within the space. And for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt full, as if something had returned to it that had been missing for longer than he had realized. He leaned back against the wall, his body finally allowing itself to rest, the exhaustion of the night settling in. But beneath it, something else remained, something steadier, something that did not fade with fatigue, and his mind drifted briefly to the place beneath the forest, the hidden room, the letter, the quiet presence of a life that had chosen to remain unseen, yet had still found a way to reach beyond itself. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking once, as if catching a sound. But then he relaxed again, his gaze soft, and Ethan followed that stillness, understanding now that not every sound needed to be chased, not every question needed an answer. Some things simply needed to be acknowledged, carried forward in their own way. The fire crackled softly, the warmth spreading gradually through the room, and the mother dog settled deeper into the blanket, her breathing calm, her body finally at rest, and Ethan watched for a moment longer before closing his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to take in the quiet, the kind that no longer felt empty, but complete. Outside, the snow continued to fall lightly, covering the tracks they had left behind, smoothing the path as if it had never been there at all. And yet the direction remained, unseen but certain, and Ethan opened his eyes again, his gaze resting on the small group by the fire, then on Rex, and finally on the faint glow of the flames. And he understood something in that moment that did not need to be spoken, that the path he had followed was not something he needed to return to. It was something he would carry with him, in the way he moved, in the way he listened, in the choices he made when no one was watching. The fire burned a little brighter, the room holding steady around it, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something long unsettled finally finds its place. And though the night outside would continue, though the world beyond the trees would remain unchanged, something within him had shifted quietly, permanently, and as he sat there, listening to the soft rhythm of breath and flame, he realized that sometimes the greatest things we find are not the ones we were searching for, but the ones that were waiting for us to stay long enough to be found.